Imagine you're walking down a street in Mohenjo-daro on a hot afternoon 4,500 years ago. The air smells like baked clay and spices. Around you, 2-story brick houses line both sides of the road, their walls perfectly uniform, built with bricks in a standardized ratio that every builder across 1,000 cities knows by heart. You can hear voices drifting from upper windows, the clatter of clay pots, children laughing somewhere down an alley. Beneath your feet runs something revolutionary, a covered drain, carefully engineered with settling pits to catch waste, fed by vertical pipes from bathing platforms inside the houses. Water flows steadily toward collection points outside the city. Above you, wooden balconies provide shade. In the marketplace ahead, merchants are haggling over carnelian beads destined for Mesopotamia, bales of cotton cloth, copper ingots stamped with symbols nobody today can read. The city hums with 40,000 people going about their lives, completely unaware they're living at the peak of one of history's greatest civilizations. Now flash forward 300 years. Same street, same brick houses, but the voices are gone. The drains are clogged with silt and garbage, no longer flowing. Doors hang open on empty rooms. The marketplace is silent. Weeds push through the paving stones. The city isn't burning. There are no bodies in the streets, no signs of battle. It's just empty, quiet. Like everyone decided to leave and never came back. This is the mystery that has haunted archaeologists for nearly a century. Around 4,600 years ago, the Indus Valley Civilization, sometimes called the Harappan Civilization, was home to somewhere between 1 and 5 million people. Think about that number. 5 million people spread across more than 1,000 cities and settlements, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the coasts of Gujarat, from the foothills of the Himalayas to the shores of the Arabian Sea. This wasn't some minor ancient culture. This was one of the 3 great Bronze Age civilizations right alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia. And then, within a few centuries, the cities were abandoned. Not destroyed, abandoned. The people scattered. The writing system, whatever it said, stopped being used. The carefully maintained drainage systems fell apart. The long-distance trade networks collapsed. And for thousands of years afterward, these magnificent cities lay buried under soil and sand, forgotten, while the world moved on without them. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe subscribe and tell me in the comments where you are right now and what time it is. I love seeing the mix. Tokyo at dawn, London at midnight, someone in Colorado at bedtime, all listening to the same ancient mystery together. Here's what makes this story so strange. There was no apocalypse. No invading army swept through and burned everything to the ground. No volcano erupted and buried the cities like Pompeii. No earthquake shattered them all at once. The truth is slower, more complex, and in some ways more unsettling than any Hollywood disaster movie. Because what happened to the Indus civilization is that it faded, gradually, over generations. And the mystery isn't just why it happened, but how 5 million people can vanish from history so completely that we didn't even know they existed until a British archaeologist stumbled across their ruins in 1921. Tonight, we're going to trace that mystery from beginning to end. We'll walk through the rise of these impossible cities, explore what life felt like at their peak, follow the climate science that's rewriting the story, chase a river that may never have existed, and discover where those 5 million people actually went. Because here's the thing, they didn't vanish, they transformed. And that transformation might be the most important part of the story. Before we can understand how those cities fell, we need to understand how they rose in the first place. Because here's what most people get wrong about the Indus civilization. It didn't just appear out of nowhere around 2600 BCE. The cities were the culmination of something much older, much deeper. They were the end result of thousands of years of people learning, adapting, and slowly building the foundations of urban life in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Picture the geography first. The Indus River rises in the Tibetan Plateau, pulls in meltwater from half a dozen major Himalayan tributaries, and flows southwest for nearly 3,000 kilometers until it empties into the Arabian Sea. Along the way, it creates a vast river plain, roughly 200,000 square miles of alluvial soil, some of the richest agricultural land in South Asia. But that fertility comes at a price. This entire system runs on the monsoon, that annual climate drama where moisture-laden winds sweep up from the Indian Ocean every summer and dump months' worth of rain in just a few weeks. When the monsoon arrives on schedule, the rivers swell, overflow their banks, deposit fresh silt across the floodplains, and everything grows. When the monsoon fails or shifts or arrives late, the land becomes a dust bowl in months. For the people trying to farm here, predicting the monsoon was everything, and they'd been trying for a very long time, go back 7,000 years, and maybe longer, the dates are still being argued over. In the catchy plain of Balochistan, a small cluster of mud brick houses sits near a seasonal stream. This is Mergar, one of the earliest farming villages in South Asia. The people here aren't living in cities. They're not writing anything down. They don't have wheels or bronze tools yet. But they've figured out something revolutionary. They can plant wheat and barley, harvest the grain, store it in mud brick granaries, and survive the dry season without following wild herds across the landscape. They're herding sheep, goats, and cattle. They're making pottery and grinding stones. Most importantly, they're staying put, generation after generation in the same place, building on the knowledge of their ancestors, and they're not isolated. Even this early, there's evidence of long-distance connections. Seashells from the coast, turquoise from Central Asia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. These materials are showing up in Mergar burials, which means somebody was trading, travelling, creating networks that link the highlands, the river plains, and the coast. Knowledge was spreading along with goods. Techniques for copper working, bead making, flint knapping. The basic toolkit of civilization was being assembled piece by piece. For the next 3,000 or 4,000 years, this process continues and accelerates. More villages appear across the Indus Plain. The crops diversify. Cotton and sesame join the wheat and barley. Water buffalo get domesticated and put to work in wetter areas. Pottery styles start to standardize across hundreds of miles, which tells you different communities are talking to each other, copying successful designs, creating shared cultural expectations. Then come the first stamp seals, small carved stone squares with animal designs and mysterious symbols. These aren't the refined seals of the mature cities yet, but their practice, experiments, the first hints of a writing system taking shape. Archaeologists call this the early Harappan period, roughly 3,300 to 2,600 BCE. It's not glamorous. There are no monuments, no massive public buildings, just towns getting a little bigger, a little more organized. Perimeter walls start appearing around some settlements. Internal layouts become more regular, less random. Trade networks expand and formalize. And everywhere, you can see this growing instinct toward standardization, toward making things the same way, toward planning and coordination across distance. These people are learning to cooperate at scales their ancestors could never have imagined. They're developing the social technologies that will eventually support cities of 40,000 people, systems for dispute resolution, for organizing labor, for managing shared resources like water and grain stores. They're breeding the crops that thrive in this climate. They're mapping the rhythms of the monsoon, generation by generation, learning which valleys flood and which stay dry, where to build and where to avoid. By 2600 BCE, when the first true cities begin rising, none of it is accidental. It's the product of 4,000 years of accumulated knowledge, trial and error, success and failure. The cities don't spring from the dust. They grow from roots that run thousands of years deep into this soil, roots that will prove important when everything starts to fall apart. Around 2600 BCE, something unprecedented happens. All that accumulated knowledge, those millennia of experimentation and slow refinement, suddenly crystallize into urban form. Within maybe 2 or 3 generations, cities appear across the Indus Plain and beyond. Not crude villages that got bigger, not gradual organic sprawl, planned cities, grid-laid streets intersecting at perfect right angles, standardized baked bricks in precise ratios, 1 unit thick by 2 units wide by 4 units long, multi-story houses with internal courtyards, private wells, bathing platforms connected to covered drainage systems running beneath every major street. This is the mature Harappan period, and it represents an organizational leap that won't be matched in most of the world for thousands of years. Picture yourself walking into Mohenjo-daro at its peak, maybe 2400 BCE. You approach from the east, across the floodplain. The city rises from the flat earth like something from another world. 2 distinct zones dominate the skyline. On the western side, elevated on artificial platforms, the citadel mound towers above the plain. Massive brick walls, maybe 12 meters high, enclose a complex of public buildings. And on the eastern side, spreading across nearly 200 hectares, the lower city sprawls in precise blocks, street after street of dense residential quarters, craft workshops, marketplaces. You enter through one of the main gateways. The streets are wider than you expect, some nearly 10 meters across. Wide enough for carts to pass each other, for crowds to gather, for the city to breathe. The surface underfoot is packed earth, but it's level and well maintained. Every intersection is a perfect right angle. You could close your eyes and navigate by the geometry alone. But the real engineering marvel is beneath your feet, running under every street, carefully constructed from fitted bricks and covered with stone slabs. Drainage channels carry wastewater away from the residential blocks. Individual houses connect through small terracotta pipes. You can hear water trickling below. Somewhere in the distance, somebody empties a bathing platform, and the water flows smoothly away, following channels that were planned before the first brick was laid. Nothing like this exists in Europe. Nothing like this will exist in Europe for 3,000 years. The houses themselves tell you something profound about this society. They're not all the same size. There's definitely wealth inequality here, but even modest homes have features that would make them luxurious by ancient standards. Private wells drawing groundwater, dedicated bathing rooms with sloped floors that drain into the city system, staircases leading to upper floors that no longer survive, but the brick foundations tell you they were there. Internal courtyards open to the sky, creating private spaces within the urban density. The citadel mound holds the city's most enigmatic structure, the Great Bath. A rectangular pool, maybe 12 meters long and 7 meters wide, descending 2.4 meters below the courtyard level. Wide brick steps lead down from both ends. The floor and walls are carefully layered, first fitted bricks, then a thick coating of bitumen for waterproofing, then gypsum mortar. Water enters from an adjacent well and exits through an elaborate corbelled drain that channels it away from the citadel. Nobody knows for certain what this was for. Ritual purification seems likely given the care in its construction, but there are no inscriptions explaining it, no obvious temple attached. Just this obsessively engineered space for water, elevated above the city, accessible through controlled gateways. Whatever happened here was important enough to command enormous resources, but the people who built it left no explanation we can read. Mohenjo-daro is the most famous site, but it's not alone. 400 kilometers northeast, Harappa sprawls along the old bank of the Ravi River. Same grid layout, same brick ratios, same drainage obsession. But Harappa has its own character. Massive brick platforms on the citadel, traditionally called granaries, though the identification is debated. Evidence of intensive craft production, metalworking, bead-making, shell carving, thousands of tiny workshops turning raw materials into finished goods, feeding trade networks that stretch from Central Asia to the Persian Gulf. Then there's Dolavira, out on an island in the Rann of Kachch, one of the most arid zones the Harappans ever settled. And here they built something extraordinary. Not one city, but 3 nested compounds, citadel within middle town within lower town, all fortified, all carefully planned. But Dolavira's real genius is water. The entire city is designed around capturing and storing every drop of monsoon rain. Massive reservoirs carved into rock, stone-lined channels directing runoff from the surrounding hills, step tanks allowing access to water at any level. In an environment that gets maybe 10 inches of rain a year, all of it in one brief season, Dolavira's engineers created a system that could sustain thousands of people year-round, and Rakhigarhi in Haryana along the now-dry Gaga plain. Recent surveys suggest it might be the largest Harappan site of all, possibly 300 hectares or more, though not everyone agrees how much of that was occupied at once. What's certain is that Rakhigarhi was a major centre throughout the early and mature periods. The excavated areas show the same grid planning, the same drainage systems, the same standardised construction as sites hundreds of miles away. That standardisation is everywhere. Archaeologists have found cubical stone weights across the entire civilization. Carefully graded series, each weight a precise ratio of the next. Same ratios from Gujarat to Punjab to Sindh. Bricks everywhere conform to that 1:2 to 4 proportion. Seals found in Harappa match seals in Mohenjo-daro. Same carving techniques, same animal motifs, same mysterious script running across the top. That script. Thousands of seals and tablets bearing short sequences of signs. Maybe 400 distinct characters, always reading right to left, often accompanied by images of animals. The unicorn, so-called. The zebu bull. The elephant. Composite creatures. They were clearly important, these seals, used to mark goods, establish ownership, maybe record transactions. But we can't read them. The inscriptions are too short. There's no bilingual text, no Rosetta Stone for the Indus Valley. The language underneath might be related to Dravidian, or Proto-Munda, or something lost entirely. Or it might not be language at all, just symbols denoting names and goods. We simply don't know, which makes the political organisation of this civilization one of archaeology's great mysteries. Because here's what's missing. Palaces, royal tombs, massive temples with priestly quarters, colossal statues of god-kings, all the things that usually announce centralised power in Bronze Age civilizations. Egypt has pyramids, Mesopotamia has ziggurats and royal graves dripping with gold. The Indus Valley has public baths, drainage systems and standardised brick modules. Did they have kings? Probably. Did they have priests? Almost certainly. But their power wasn't expressed through monuments that scream, "I am eternal, I am mighty, I am God made flesh." Instead, their legacy is infrastructure, water management, urban planning, quality control across hundreds of settlements spanning 1 million square kilometres. It suggests a kind of power we have trouble recognising. Not the power of one man commanding thousands, but the power of shared standards, collective agreement, systems so deeply embedded that everyone follows them without needing a palace to enforce compliance. The power of people who looked at a river plain and a seasonal monsoon and said, "We can build something here that lasts. We can organise at scales nobody has tried before. We can create cities unlike anything the ancient world has seen." And for 700 years they were right. But the monsoon was about to stop cooperating. And when it did, all the engineering genius would face its ultimate test. But these cities weren't islands. They weren't self-contained worlds sealed behind their perfect brick walls. The Indus civilization was plugged into something bigger, a web of exchange that stretched from the highlands of Afghanistan to the royal tombs of Mesopotamia, from the copper mines of Oman to the forests of the Himalayan foothills. They were traders, and not just casual opportunistic traders swapping goods with neighbours. They were running systematic long-distance trade networks that moved commodities across thousands of kilometres, connecting civilizations that had never heard each other's languages. The evidence shows up in the strangest places. Royal Cemetery of Ur, southern Mesopotamia, sometime around 2500 BCE. Archaeologists excavating the graves of Sumerian elite find carnelian beads. Not just any carnelian, but beads etched with distinctive white patterns, made using a technique that nobody in Mesopotamia knows how to replicate. These beads are Harappan, made in workshops along the Indus, carried across deserts and seas, valuable enough to bury with kings and queens 2,000 miles from where they were crafted. And it's not just one or two beads, it's dozens, hundreds across multiple sites. The Mesopotamians prized them specifically, treated them as exotic luxury goods, symbols of wealth and connection to distant lands. Centuries later, the Sumerian ruler Gudea mentions in his inscriptions that carnelian comes from Meluha, a distant land across the sea. Most scholars now agree Meluha is their name for the Indus region. The texts give us glimpses of how this trade actually worked. Akkadian inscriptions from the time of Sargon-of-Akkad, around 2300 BCE, boast that ships from Dilmun, Magan and Meluha dock at Akkad. Later administrative tablets from Ur record boats from Melahar, bringing timber and other goods, paying dock fees, unloading cargoes. These aren't vague myths. These are bureaucrats tracking imports, taxing merchants, managing a maritime trade network that connected 3 civilizations across the Persian Gulf. The geography tells the rest. Dilmun is Bahrain, that low sandy island roughly midway between Mesopotamia and the Indus. Magan is Oman and the Emirates, copper-rich mountains along the Gulf's southern shore. And Meluha, source of carnelian and cotton and exotic woods, is the Indus world. The sea route runs down the Mesopotamian rivers to the Gulf, hugs the Arabian coast to avoid open water, stops at Dilmun for transshipment and fresh water, continues to Magan for copper ingots, then makes the longer crossing to the Indus coast. We know this because we've found the ports. Lothal in Gujarat near the Gulf of Kambat. The site sits beside an ancient course of the Sabarmati River, and right there in the middle of the settlement is an artificial basin, about 215 metres long and 35 metres wide, constructed from the same standardised bricks as everything else. A massive tidal dock, channels connect it to the river, a brick platform and warehouses sit beside it. When the river was flowing properly, this was the Indus civilization's gateway to the ocean. Ships built here or arriving here could load goods from the interior. Carnelian beads from workshops in Mohenjo-daro, cotton textiles. The Harappans were possibly the first people in the world to cultivate and weave cotton. Ivory from elephants, either hunted or possibly kept. Shell bangles produced at coastal workshops. Timber floated down from highland forests. All of it converging at ports like Lothal, then loading onto vessels capable of making the Gulf crossing. What they brought back was equally vital. Copper from Oman. The Indus region has relatively little native copper, and the civilization consumed it in enormous quantities. Silver, probably from Afghanistan or Anatolia. Mesopotamian goods, cylinder seals occasionally show up in Harappan contexts, and raw materials from the internal trade web that kept these cities functioning. Because the resource network wasn't just international, it was continental. Lapis lazuli, that brilliant blue stone that shows up in Harappan seals and jewellery, comes from exactly one ancient source, the Saraswati mines in the Kuksha Valley of Badakhshan, northeastern Afghanistan. That's over 1,500 kilometers from Mohenjo-daro. Somebody had to organize caravans, establish relationships with highland miners, maintain routes through mountain passes that close half the year. This wasn't casual exchange. This was systematic resource extraction managed across distances that would challenge modern logistics. Gold probably came from the south, Karnataka or other regions of peninsular India, travelling upriver and overland to reach the Indus cities. Timber for construction and boat building came from Himalayan foothills. Massive logs floated downriver during high water, stockpiled in cities like Harappa, where evidence of lumber yards has been found. Shell for bangles, an ornament so common in Harappan sites that coastal workshops must have been producing them at industrial scale, came from both marine sources along the Arabian Sea coast and possibly riverine sources inland. And the craft centres. Oh, the craft centres. Chanudaro in Sindh wasn't just a city, it was a manufacturing hub. Excavations uncovered what archaeologists called a bead-making factory, multiple workshop areas with furnaces, raw stone blanks, finished beads at various stages of production. They were making beads from carnelian, jasper, quartz, agate, also faience, that glazed ceramic material that requires sophisticated firing techniques. Also shell, metal, terracotta, thousands upon thousands of beads. The carnelian work was especially remarkable. To create those white-etched patterns that Mesopotamians loved, Harappan craftspeople developed a complex chemical process. They painted designs on the bead surface using an alkaline paste, possibly natron, then heated the beads. The alkali bleached the stone white wherever it touched, creating permanent patterns. Nobody else in the Bronze Age world knew how to do this. It was proprietary Harappan technology and the drilling. They were drilling beads with holes so precisely centered, so perfectly cylindrical, that modern jewelers struggle to understand the techniques. Some holes are less than a millimetre in diameter, running through stones harder than steel. They probably used bronze drills tipped with harder stones, running with abrasive paste, requiring extraordinary patience and skill. Each finished bead represented hours of specialised labour. This craft economy created vulnerability disguised as strength. When the system worked, when rivers flowed and monsoons arrived and trade ships made their passages on schedule, wealth poured into these cities. Raw materials from a dozen regions converged. Skilled workers transformed them into valuable goods. Finished products flowed out to distant markets. The whole civilization hummed like a perfectly balanced machine. But machines break, and when they do, the more complex they are, the harder they fall. If copper shipments from Oman stopped arriving, bronze workers in Harappa had nothing to cast. If the harbour at Lothal silted up, cutting the sea route, cities in Gujarat lost their connection to Gulf trade. If drought in Afghanistan disrupted lapis mining, or if highland passes stayed closed too long, or if any one of 100 links in this continental web snapped, the effects rippled everywhere. The Harappans had built a system of extraordinary sophistication and reach, but they'd also built a system that depended on everything continuing to work, on rivers flowing where they'd always flowed, on monsoons arriving when they'd always arrived, on distant partners continuing to need what they offered. They'd created interdependence at a scale that Bronze Age logistics could barely sustain. And the monsoon was about to test every assumption they'd ever made. So what was it like to actually live inside this machine? Not as an archaeologist walking through baked ruins in the desert heat 3,000 years later, as a person, as someone who woke up in Mohenjo-daro or Harappa or Holavira on an ordinary morning with no idea that future historians would one day argue about whether your whole world had collapsed. Picture this. The air's cool just before dawn. You sleep on a flat roof or in an upstairs room. the night wind still clinging to the brick. Below you, the city is a tight grid of houses, all right angles and straight lines, but it doesn't feel rigid. It feels familiar. Courtyards, staircases, narrow alleys that you could navigate blindfolded. You know the pattern because you've lived inside it your whole life. From somewhere nearby, you catch the first smell of the day, grain roasting. Down in a courtyard, someone has started grinding wheat and 6-row barley on a stone quern. The rhythm is slow, steady, almost hypnotic. Wheat and barley are what keep this city alive, harvested from fields along the river, carried in by bullock cart, stored in big ceramic jars against the uncertainty of the monsoon. Mixed with water, patted into flat rounds, slapped against the side of a clay oven. In a little while the streets will be carrying the smell of fresh bread. Other scents ride with it. Crushed green peas simmering in a pot, sesame oil heating, nutty and sharp. Dates softening over the fire, syrupy and dark. In some houses, especially further east toward the wetter plains, people are experimenting with something newer, smaller grained, fussier about water. Rice. Not the backbone of the diet yet, not the way wheat and barley are, but present. A hint of the agricultural future, hiding in someone's field. Cotton is already part of your world, not as a marvel, not as a rare luxury, just as cloth. Ordinary, familiar, woven on looms that creak softly in the half-light. This is one of the first places on earth where people figured out how to make this plant into thread, into fabric that breathes in the heat. If you're poor, your clothes might be simple, undyed, and off-white that matches the dust. If you're better off, you might wear cloth-stained red or blue, wrapped in careful folds, held in place with a bead or a pin. You step out into the lane. The bricks under your feet are smooth from thousands of steps before yours. The street isn't just a passageway, it's part of a hidden machine. Along one side, covered by slabs of brick or stone, a drain runs the length of the block. You can't see it, but you can hear it after a night of rain. Water whispering under the pavement, flowing toward a larger street, then a larger drain, then out of the city altogether. Almost every house on either side of you has its own private connection to that system. Little chutes coming out at ankle height, vertical pipes dropping from an upper floor into the covered channel. Inside, behind those walls, someone is rinsing grain, washing their hands, bathing in a corner room with a slightly sloping brick floor and a drain hole at one end. The dirty water doesn't run into the street. It disappears neatly, efficiently, into that hidden river under the bricks. For the Bronze Age, this is weird, strange. Most cities in your world are places where waste accumulates in alleys, where cesspits overflow, where standing water breeds smells and sickness. Here, in the Indus world, somebody decided long ago that water should be guided, controlled, channeled. Wells are everywhere. You might share one with your neighbours or have your own built right into your courtyard, ringed with perfectly aligned bricks. Dolavira, far to the southwest, has gone even further, carving out enormous reservoirs, broad steps leading down to cool water stored from the brief, furious monsoon for the long dry season to come. You don't know the word infrastructure, but you live inside it. After the rain, when the monsoon really opens up, this network comes to life. You hear it. Water rushing off flat roofs, splashing into brick-lined catchments, cascading down spillways into the big tanks at Dolavira or into smaller cisterns in other towns. Street drains running full, then slowly emptying, carrying away not just runoff but the excess of bathing, washing, cooking. Cleanliness isn't an abstract virtue here. It's a daily practice built into the architecture. You bathe not occasionally, as a special ritual, but regularly, because the house gives you a place to do it, because the city gives the house somewhere for the water to go. Archaeologists will later argue about what this means. Does it signal some early idea of ritual purity? Just practical engineering for high-density living? A cultural preference for order? Without texts, it's hard to say. But from inside the system, it just feels normal. Of course you wash. Of course the wastewater disappears into the bricks and doesn't come back. By mid-morning the city is fully awake. Carts creak past, wooden wheels rumbling on the packed earth between brick pavements. 2 bullocks lean into the yoke, bells faintly clinking against their necks. The cart is loaded with sacks, barley, maybe, or sesame seeds destined for an oil press. A merchant walks behind, calling out greetings, pausing to talk to another trader whose courtyard doubles as a tiny workshop. Children weave around the cart, playing their own version of this adult world. They drag terracotta toy carts behind them, miniature versions with solid wheels and little modelled yokes. They race clay animals along the drain cover slabs, invent games with small figurines that look like people, or cattle, or birds. These toys will survive when the wooden carts rot away and the cotton clothes crumble to dust. Archaeologists thousands of years later will hold them in their hands and see exactly what you see now, a city where children's play imitates adult work, where the idea of a cart, of wheels and movement and trade, is important enough that kids build their own worlds around it. On wrists and necks, tiny flashes of colour move through the brown dust and pale brick. Shell bangles, cut and polished in coastal workshops far to the south, have made their way even here, far inland. Women stack them almost to the elbow. Men wear them too, sometimes in fewer numbers. Carnelian beads from workshops like Mohenjo-daro glow a deep translucent red at the throat. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, rare and expensive, shows up in a few houses, an intense blue that looks almost unreal in this light. Steatite beads, faience amulets, occasional glints of gold or silver. Not confined to palaces or temples, there are no towering royal tombs here, but scattered through ordinary homes, dropped in courtyards, buried with people who weren't kings. Jewellery in this world isn't just for the distant elite. It's part of daily life, a way of being a person in a city where most other things, the bricks, the house plans, even the weights the merchants use, follow strict standardized rules. Your beads and bangles are some of the few things that feel uniquely yours. Somewhere beyond the houses, beyond the orderly streets, the fields begin. Your diet depends on those fields working properly, on irrigated plots and rain-fed patches producing enough wheat, barley, peas, sesame, on date palms bearing along river banks, on the fragile balance between river floods that are generous and floods that are catastrophic. You've heard stories, maybe, about years when the monsoon fails, when the river runs low, when the grain jars empty too soon. That fear is part of your world, a tension humming under the everyday routine. At the edge of the city there are quieter places, cemeteries. No pyramids rise here, no ziggurat stair-step toward the sky. The graves are shallow pits, carefully dug, bodies placed extended, head usually oriented in some consistent way, though the exact rules vary from site to site. With the dead, people place pottery, bowls, jars, dishes, sometimes shell bangles, sometimes a carnelian bead, a copper mirror, a simple tool. Compared to the royal burials of Egypt or Mesopotamia, it all looks modest. Later scholars will look at this and at the relative uniformity of house sizes and argue that this society might have been less sharply divided, less obsessed with monumental displays of rank. Others will point to subtler cues, better access to wells in certain neighbourhoods, finer quality objects in some graves, and see hierarchy all the same, just expressed more quietly. From inside you know that some people are richer, better connected, more powerful than others. But you don't live in the shadow of a king's tomb. Your dead rest under fields and sands, marked by pottery and memory rather than stone mountains. And over all of this, over the grinding of grain, the splash of bath water, the murmur of carts and traders and children, there's something missing. Words. Not the spoken words of the marketplace or the workshop. Those flow easily enough in a language that will leave almost no trace. What's missing for us looking back are the written ones, the script you see on little seals and potsherds, on tags that mark bales of goods, on objects that might be amulets or labels or something in between. That script has never told us its secrets. You use it perhaps. You or someone you know presses a carved seal into wet clay, leaving a line of tiny signs and a neat image of a bull or a unicorn or a plant. To you, those marks have meaning. A name, a clan, a place, an official office, a prayer. To us, watching from the future, they are silent. We can reconstruct your drains, your crops, your jewellery, your toys. We can map your streets and measure your reservoirs and hold your bread ovens in our hands. But your stories, your laws, your songs to the monsoon, your explanations for why the dead are given pottery, why bathing matters, why certain animals appear again and again on your seals, those remain locked behind a code we haven't yet broken. The Indus civilization is a world we can touch but cannot fully hear, so we stand in your streets in imagination, listening to water whisper under the bricks, smelling bread and sesame and wet dust after rain, watching children race terracotta carts, knowing that somewhere, just out of reach, are the words you used to describe this life to each other. And as the centuries pass, as the monsoon begins to falter and the rivers start to change their minds, it will be those unrecorded words, those choices, fears, and quiet decisions that decide how this neat, ordered world slowly comes undone. For most of your life, the monsoon has been a promise. You don't think of it as the Indian summer monsoon, or connect it to anything called the intertropical convergence zone. It's just the season when the sky darkens in a particular way, when the wind changes, when a certain taste comes into the air and everyone starts looking up a little more often. It has moods. Some years it arrives early, with showy, pounding storms that drum on roofs and turn lanes to slick mud. Some years it's late and people grumble. Farmers glance at the sky more often. Merchants hesitate to send caravans until they know the rivers will rise. But beneath the year-to-year fussiness there's a deeper feeling, the sense that, in the end, the monsoon will come through. It's what makes this whole world possible. Those neat grids of brick and drain and courtyard don't float in a vacuum. They sit on floodplains and alluvial fans, on low terraces above rivers that are themselves swollen and fed by the summer rains. When the monsoon climbs north in its great seasonal migration, it pours water onto the highlands and the plains. Rivers swell, spill into their floodplains, spread out in shallow sheets that soak the land, drop fresh silt, recharge shallow groundwater. Most of the time, nobody has to build grand irrigation canals here. The system is already built into the landscape. Wheat and barley drink from the receding floodwaters. Date palms sink their roots into levees and banks. Wells tap the water that has seeped down and settled after each season's rain. The monsoon refills everything: rivers, lakes, tanks, the invisible aquifers beneath the bricks. Even in the drier west, where towns like Dolavira sit on stony ground between seasonal streams, the rain is still the invisible engine. The whole city is a trap for water. Sloping streets, stone-lined channels, catchments carved into bedrock, at least 16 deep reservoirs tucked inside the walls or along them. When the monsoon storms sweep across the island or just brush past it, suddenly those quiet structures become alive, gulping in runoff, holding it in the cool dark for months. 1 or 2 missed years the system can handle. That's what it's for. But systems like this have expectations built into them. hidden assumptions. They're not designed for a world where the sky slowly changes its mind. From our vantage far in the future, we can watch that change in slow motion. Sediments in old lake beds, isotopes locked in stalagmites, grains of silt caught in ancient river terraces, they act like diaries the climate forgot to burn. When scientists tease those records open and feed them into climate and hydrology models, a pattern appears. Between roughly 4,450 and 3,400 years ago, so from near the height of Harappan urban life into the centuries when the big cities thin out, something starts to shift. Not in a single dramatic jump, not a switch flipped overnight, but in a series of long drawn-out turns. On average, the whole Indus Basin gets about 10 to 20% less rain than it used to. Temperatures nudge up by about 0.5 degrees Celsius. It doesn't sound like much. You might not notice it in a single lifetime. But it's not just the amount of rain that changes, it's where and when it falls. The great belt of tropical thunderstorms, the intertropical convergence zone, had once pushed farther north and west each summer, bringing the heavy core of the monsoon into the lands of the Indus. Now, for reasons that likely involve distant oceans, shifts in sea surface temperatures, the dance of El Niño and the Indian Ocean, that belt begins to sag southward. The monsoon weakens over the northwest. The heaviest, most reliable rains start to fall farther south and east. To you, as a farmer or a city dweller, this doesn't feel like a grand atmospheric reorganization. It feels like this year the river didn't quite reach the fields it used to. It feels like the tank is lower than my grandfather remembers. It feels like the well that never failed my mother's house has gone brackish at the bottom. And it doesn't happen just once. The new modelling suggests that laid on top of this general drying and warming trend, there were at least 4 major drought episodes. Not bad harvests for 2 or 3 years, multi-decade events, each one stretching across more than 80 years, sometimes more than a century, each one touching most of the basin, 2/3 of it at minimum, sometimes more than 90%. That means that from the foothills of the Himalaya down to the lower Indus, from the Gaga Hakra plain across to Sindh and Kutch, rain was reduced year after year after year. Not gone, just diminished and increasingly unreliable. Then, between these long parched stretches, the system would seem to relax. Rains improve for a time. Rivers swell a little more. Crops recover. Children grow up hearing their elders talk about the bad years, but they themselves see the system working again. Only it never quite goes back to what it was. Each drought pushes the line a little farther. Lakes shrink, then refill to a slightly smaller shoreline. Wetlands, once dense with reeds and fish and waterfowl, contract. Some never quite return, turning to scrub or salt-encrusted flats. The generous overbank floods that used to spread across fields come less often or with less depth. The tips of distributary channels fall dry. Groundwater, not fully replenished, sits a little lower each decade. For a while, the cities absorb the shock. This is what they were built to do, buffer people against the whims of weather. Granaries and storage jars hold surplus from good years. Wells and drains and tanks squeeze value out of every drop. Trade routes pull in food and goods from regions that are having better seasons, spreading the risk. If you live in Mohenjo-daro in the earlier phases of this drying, your daily life may not seem obviously apocalyptic. The bread still bakes, the drains still whisper, beads still arrive from the coasts and the highlands. But somewhere beyond the horizon, upstream, the rivers that feed your fields have become slightly thinner threads, and the farmers on their banks are working harder to pull a harvest from reluctant soil. Less rain upstream means less silt and less water arriving at your floodplain. Winter crops that relied on the slow retreat of floodwaters over the fields don't get the same thick drink. Yields dip, maybe not disastrously, but enough that there's less margin for error. Meanwhile, those shallow aquifers under your city rely on recharge from seasonal rains and from the raised river levels pressing water sideways into the ground. Drop the monsoon, the pressure drops too. Wells that once were comfortably full by the end of each rainy season now graze the bottom by the time the next one should arrive. In Dolavira, the stone reservoirs do their job, but each dry spell bites a little deeper. When you rely on catching pulses of rain to get you through long, dry months, and those pulses weaken, you can't simply turn up a tap somewhere else. The effects ripple outward into every part of life. Shrinking lakes and marshes mean fewer fish, fewer mollusks, fewer wild plants to gather when crops fail. Herds of cattle and water buffalo need more land and more effort to keep them watered, pushing pastoralists to move more often, to press further into marginal zones or into lands that farmers also want. Over time, that tension accumulates. In the background, trade feels the strain too. River levels dictate boat traffic. As monsoon-fed channels become seasonal trickles in some stretches, shipping windows narrow. Caravans must detour to skirt expanding arid patches or to connect to the remaining dependable water sources. A merchant may not know the word hydrology, but they know that a route that once took 10 days now takes 12 or 15, and that the risks feel greater. None of this by itself tears a city down in one season. That's the insidious part. The crisis works more like a ratchet than a hammer. Each long drought pushes the system into a slightly more stressed configuration. Fields are abandoned at the dry margins first. Settlements at the edge of the network thin out. Families move closer to reliable rivers or to regions where the weakening monsoon is still strong enough. Perhaps eastward, toward the Ganga plain where the shifted rain belt now lingers longer. Then a partial recovery comes. Rains improve. For a generation or two, people talk about how the gods have remembered us. But the farms that were abandoned at the edge aren't all reclaimed. Some are too degraded now, their thin soils blown or washed away. The lake that once supported a cluster of fishing hamlets never quite refills to its old richness. The new normal is a little narrower. Previous studies, even before the latest models, had already hinted at this story. A gradual weakening of the Indus monsoon and an eastward drift of where the real action of the rain was happening. The new work doesn't overturn that picture, it sharpens it. Instead of a single long decline, we see pulses, surges of drought separated by incomplete reprieves. From inside the Harappan world, these pulses would have been lived as sequences of hard decades and easier ones. A child born at the beginning of one drought might never see a truly generous flood in their entire lifetime. A grandchild born in a partial recovery might hear tales of worse times and believe the danger is past. All the while, the foundations of the urban system, literally and metaphorically, are being undermined by the slow retreat of water. The carefully laid drains still function, but the wells they connect to are shallower. The reservoirs are still there, but their catchment areas are drier. The great monsoon that once felt like a dependable partner in the annual work of living has started to behave like something else. A powerful force that no longer listens quite as closely to the needs of the plains. The cities don't fall silent yet. That comes later, and not everywhere at once. For now, people adapt, improvise, endure. But the background conditions that allowed millions to cluster in brick-lined order are shifting under their feet. The monsoon is still coming. It's just not coming for them in quite the same way anymore. If you could rise up gently above this drying landscape and look down, there is one feature your eyes would keep getting pulled back to. A pale, sinuous scar running across the plains, broad, flat, oddly empty. It begins near the low Shivalik hills, threads through what is now Haryana and Rajasthan, then drifts westward into the Cholistan desert of Pakistan, before fading into sand. From the air in certain lights it's obvious. An old river course, now quiet. A ghost channel. Today we call it the Gaga Hakra. On the ground, along this dry corridor, archaeologists have walked and dug and sifted. What they keep finding over and over are traces of Harappan life. Small villages, larger towns, little scatters of pottery and brick. In some stretches there are more Harappan period sites along this dead riverbed than along the living Indus itself. It's as if, once, this empty channel had been a spine for an entire world. Long before satellite imagery, people in South Asia had another name in mind for a mighty life-giving river that seemed to have vanished: Saraswati. In some of the oldest hymns of the Rig Veda, Saraswati is praised as a powerful river flowing from the mountains to the sea. Not a trickle, not a minor stream, but a great roaring presence. She's a deity and a geography at the same time. For centuries, poets, pilgrims, priests and scholars have tried to match that sacred description to the actual map. So when 19th and 20th century explorers noticed this broad, dry river course, and then noticed the density of ancient sites along it, a compelling story almost wrote itself. The Gaga Hakra, some argued, must be the lost Saraswati. Once a vigorous Himalayan-fed river rushing down from the high snows, it flowed between the Indus and the Ganga, nourishing cities and fields. Then something happened. The river was cut off from its glacial sources, or swallowed by the desert, or abruptly changed course. Without its water, the civilization it supported withered and died, one great river, one sudden catastrophe. One vanishing civilization. It's a narrative with deep emotional pull. It touches living religious traditions that revere Saraswati not just as a river, but as a goddess of knowledge and speech. It fits with ideas of continuity between Vedic culture and the deep past of northwest India. It has also become entangled with modern politics, national identity, and debates about who was here first. But when you start to ask the landscape itself for its version of the story, the answers get more complicated. A river doesn't just disappear without leaving clues. It leaves behind sand and silt, terraces and cut banks, little signatures in the minerals it carries. Those can be read in the same slow, careful way scientists read the diaries hidden in stalagmites and lake mud. When geologists sampled the old Gaga Hakra channel and traced the origin of the sands within it, a pattern emerged. The grains didn't just say, "A big river once flowed here." They said, which big river? They pointed north and west toward the Sutlej. At some point in the deeper past, the Sutlej, the same Himalayan river that now joins the Indus in Pakistan, took a very different path. It flowed down through what is now the Gaga Hakra corridor, pouring cold, glacier-fed water and silt across that plain. In those days, long before any bricks were laid at Mohenjo-daro or Harappa, this ghost channel was a real, powerful river. But the sands also tell us when that changed. Using techniques like optically stimulated luminescence, which can reveal when mineral grains were last exposed to sunlight, researchers reconstructed the Sutlej's history. The dates they got were surprisingly old. The Sutlej seems to have started abandoning the Gaga Hakra route around 15,000 years ago, near the end of the last ice age. By a little after 8,000 years ago, before 6000 BCE, it had fully shifted to its present course, firmly committed to the Indus basin. That's thousands of years before the first urban Harappan streets were laid out, before the mature Harappan phase, even before the earlier, village-based phases that slowly grew into that urban world. So by the time the big Harappan cities are humming, the period we've been walking through in this story, this channel is no longer carrying a full-bodied perennial Himalayan river. The Gaga Hakra is something else. It's a monsoon river. Think of it as a seasonal artery, pulsing with life when the rains are generous, fading back to a narrower flow in the dry months. Fed not by distant glaciers that don't care if one year's monsoon is weak, but by the rains themselves. by the very system we just watched slowly pulling its strength away from this region. Along its banks, Harappan communities thrive all the same. They build in mud brick and baked brick. They farm fields that drink from the seasonal floods. They sink wells into shallow aquifers that swell after good monsoon years. Some settlements are sizable towns, others are more modest. Together they form one of the densest clusters of Harappan sites anywhere. From the ground, from the perspective of a farmer in one of these towns, the Gaga Hakra might feel every bit as real and essential as any great river. It brings water, it lays down silt, it shapes routes for trade and travel. Its bed is wide and impressive, carved in earlier, wetter times when flows were stronger. But it has a different kind of vulnerability built into it. If you live by the Indus proper, or by one of its main glacial tributaries, a bad monsoon year upstream might mean slightly lower summer floods, fewer overbank spreads, a tighter season. But the river still flows. The snow and ice high in the mountains still melt each year, providing a baseline of water that doesn't instantly track every shift in the sky. If you live by a monsoon-fed seasonal river, that cushion doesn't exist. Cut the rain, and the river itself begins to thin, to fragment, to fail. As the centuries we were just tracing unfold, those long, drawn-out drought episodes that 10 to 20% decline in rainfall across the basin, the Gaga Hakra's situation changes dramatically. What had been a relatively reliable seasonal river becomes patchier. In good years it still swells, perhaps enough to spread modestly across its floodplain. In middling years it may flow strongly for a shorter season. In bad decades its upper reaches might run only briefly, or break into disconnected pools and marshy stretches, while downstream the channel stays dry for most of the year. For the hundreds of Harappan settlements strung along its banks, this isn't an abstract hydrological shift. It's wells that don't refill as high as they used to. It's fields that have to be left fallow because the flood didn't quite reach them this season. It's cattle walking further and further from the village to find water, returning leaner. A few bad years, a clever water management system can buffer. Stored grain, deeper wells, small tanks and ponds, cooperation with neighbouring villages. But recall those droughts are not just bad years. They stretch across lifetimes. One, then another, with incomplete relief in between. In that context, living on a marginal monsoon-fed river becomes risky in a way it wasn't before. We can see the consequences in the archaeology. Over time, many of the larger Harappan sites along the Gaga Hakra show signs of contraction. The densest occupation layers thin. Some settlements are abandoned entirely. Smaller, later villages appear in different positions, closer to whatever water remains, or farther east and north where the weakened monsoon still has a bit more strength. It's not that a single, mighty Saraswati collapsed overnight and took the civilization with it. Instead, a whole set of seasonal rivers and streams, of which the Gaga Hakra was one of the most important, gradually lost their reliability. The backbone of settlements they supported became harder and harder to sustain. These sacred stories, the hymns to Saraswati, may encode memories of fuller rivers and broader flows, of a time when this corridor was greener, when water really did seem to move from the mountains to the sea. They may also blend idealization with geography, as sacred traditions often do. The exact relationship between the text Saraswati and the physical Gaga Hakra remains debated, and probably always will, especially while the dates of those compositions themselves are argued over. What the sediments and the settlement patterns agree on, though, is that by the high tide of Harappan urbanism, this corridor was living on a knife edge of monsoon rain, and when the monsoon started stepping away, the knife edge began to crumble. That doesn't make the Saraswati Gaga Hakra story less meaningful. If anything, it makes it deeper. Instead of a single dramatic disaster, We see generations of people trying to hold on in a landscape that was, very slowly, losing its water. People moving, adapting, resiting their villages, carrying their habits and their gods with them as the river beneath their feet turned, over centuries from current to memory. The mystery of the vanished river, then, isn't a magician's trick where something is there one moment and gone the next. It's a long fading out written in sand and silt and abandoned wells, a fading that set the stage for what would happen to the cities themselves as the dry beds of ghost rivers began to echo the slow quieting of brick-lined streets. If you follow that fading river corridor out of the desert and turn back toward the heartland, the cities are still there. Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira. From a distance in their last centuries they probably still looked impressive. Brick mounds on the horizon, big platforms, grids of streets, wells, the familiar outline of a world that had once been confident. But when you walk closer in time, layer by layer, the texture changes. Start with Mohenjo-daro. In its prime, the city is like a machine for managing water and waste. Straight streets, covered drains running like capillaries along each lane, house after house carefully tied into that system with little side channels. Somebody cared enough to plan this and to keep it running. Now move your hand up the stratigraphy, a century, 2, 3. You're still walking the same streets, but they don't quite work the same way. A drain that once ran clear is now half packed with silt and garbage. At first you see improvisations, a rough patch here, a low wall built to steer water around a blockage, then more drastic fixes, a section of drain simply abandoned and bricked over. A householder carving a new crooked channel out to the street because the old connection doesn't function anymore. The walls tell the same story. In the mature levels, bricks are neat, uniform, laid with that familiar Harappan ratio. In the later phases, you start to see something different. Broken bricks reused to make new walls. Old structures cannibalized so someone can repair a roof or raise a floor. Entire houses rebuilt with whatever is at hand, not with fresh, standardized material from a central kiln. Rooms begin to shrink. Where there had been a spacious courtyard, there is now a wall across the middle. One room becomes 2, then 3. Storage spaces are carved off from living areas. Families double up. New hearths appear in corners that were never meant for cooking. The city is still inhabited, but it feels tight, improvised. Less like a carefully planned grid, more like a place people are squeezing what they can from. Even the streets contract. In the bright, orderly phase, thoroughfares are kept mostly clear. In the latest levels, little rooms and platforms push into public space. A wall nibbles a bit of a lane. A shopfront spills out over a drain. What had been open, communal areas are encroached upon by small private needs. To some archaeologists, these look like squatter occupations, people moving into what had once been public or ceremonial buildings, dividing them up, using them as housing or workshops. Not a city being burned or smashed, but a city being slowly recycled from the inside. Nothing here says sudden disaster. There are no thick layers of ash, no mass graves in the streets, no abandoned treasures dropped in flight. Instead, there is a long, slow slide from meticulous maintenance to patchwork survival. Harappa, to the north, tells a related but slightly different story. In its mature days, it's another great hub of brick and order. Granaries, if that's what they were, lined up on platforms, wide streets, a sense of scale and regularity. Then the layers change. On and around the oldest city mounds a new kind of material appears. Reddish pottery painted in black, peacocks with their tails curled, antelopes, stars, bold geometric bands. The motifs are familiar and strange at the same time. You see continuities with older Harappan designs, but also something decisively new. Archaeologists call this the Cemetery H culture, after one of the places it shows up with particular clarity. Here, burial practices change too. Where earlier Harappan cemeteries leaned toward extended inhumations, bodies laid out full length in graves, Cemetery H levels give you something more varied. Some individuals are still buried in the earth, but others are different. They've been cremated, their bones gathered and placed into those painted urns. The vessels themselves become coffins, holding the reduced, carefully selected remains. The cemetery is not the only place where this new aesthetic appears. As you move through the late levels of the city, that Cemetery H pottery is scattered across the mounds, in house floors, in pits, in layers where buildings encroach onto what had once been open streets or public spaces. Harappa in its last centuries feels crowded. There are new kilns, different in style from the earlier industrial installations. There are hybrid assemblages where classic fine Harappan ceramics sit side by side with the bold Cemetery H jars. Bones from these layers whisper other changes. Some analyses suggest that at least part of this population looks different, physically, from the earlier city dwellers. Not completely alien, but not simply the same group carrying on unchanged. Perhaps newcomers marrying in. Perhaps old families absorbing migrants. Perhaps a slow reshaping of who calls Harappa home. Whatever is happening, it isn't a clean continuation, and it isn't a simple replacement either. It's a mixing, a reconfiguration, on a landscape whose big urban frame is starting to come apart. Then, far to the southwest, out on a rocky island surrounded by the salt flats of the Rann of Kutch, there's Dolavira. In its flourishing phase, Dolavira feels almost over-engineered, a walled city within walls, reservoirs carved and lined with stone, positioned to trap every possible drop of seasonal water, rainfall, channel flow, runoff from the citadel itself. In the middle, above the gate, that famous signboard, 10 large symbols cut in gypsum and set on a wooden frame, staring out at whoever enters. One of the longest Indus inscriptions we know. But Dolavira's life is not a straight line. Archaeologists trace at least 2 periods where the city is abandoned and then reoccupied. People leave, the wind and salt creep in, then people come back and try again. By the final phase, the confidence has drained away. Those massive reservoirs are silting up. Some are no longer maintained at all. Channels that once fed them are choked. The careful dance between monsoon, catchment and storage has lost a step. The signboard has fallen. At some point, the great inscribed panel that once loomed over a gate simply drops. The wooden support decays. The gypsum signs lie face up or face down on the ground, and then, over years, they are buried by dust and debris. The proud text that once declared something important to everyone who entered is now invisible, a secret underfoot. The city doesn't explode. It fades. When you pull back from these individual stories, a pattern emerges that doesn't look like a plague sweeping through, or an army sacking everything in its path. It looks like people quietly leaving. As the big urban centres fray, the map of smaller sites thickens, especially around the edges. To the south, in Saurashtra and Kutch, late Harappan and related cultures settle into new clusters. To the east, in the upper Ganga-Yamuna Doab and along the Ganga-Yamuna belt, small villages and towns with Harappan roots or Harappan-influenced ceramics begin to dot the landscape more densely. Up toward the Himalayan foothills, new communities appear where the weakened monsoon still has a bit more bite, where streams run a little more reliably. It's as if the cities are exhaling their people. Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dolavira don't empty, because everyone in them dies. They empty because, over generations, families decide that life might be more workable somewhere else, closer to a surviving branch of a river, nearer to rain-fed fields, away from the crumbling burden of maintaining big public works that no longer quite match the climate, What disappears in this process is striking. The script, for one thing. Those neat little signs impressed on seals and tablets, carved on D'Oliveira's great board, simply stop appearing in new contexts. There is no long, messy, late style. It just fades out of use. Somewhere a last scribe presses a last sign into wet clay, and no one ever copies it again. The standardized weights too, the tiny stone cubes that once enforced a shared measure from Gujarat to the Punjab, become rarer. Trade still exists, but the grand, long-distance circuits that carried lapis from Afghanistan, shells from the Arabian Sea, copper from Oman to Harappan workshops begin to thin. Fewer exotic materials show up in inland sites. The network retracts. Monumental construction halts. Those big platforms, those elaborate brick-lined baths, those massive reservoirs, nobody builds new ones on that scale. The expertise is still there, in principle, but the will and the surplus and the central coordination are not. And yet when you stoop closer, so much is still going on. People continue to fire pottery, though the styles shift into more local, regional traditions. They still live in mud brick houses, though the layouts simplify. They farm, they herd animals. There is still exchange, but it is shorter range, stitched between neighbouring villages and small towns rather than across a whole subcontinent-spanning web. From one angle, this is a collapse. A great urban system unravels, its signature achievements abandoned. From another angle, it is a transformation. 5 million people taking the skills they've honed over centuries of city life, irrigation, storage, craft, cooperation, and redeploying them in a new pattern, better suited to a harsher, less predictable world. The echo in the dust isn't just of what ended. It's of a choice made, again and again, by families packing up their lives in brick-lined streets and walking out towards smaller horizons, carrying with them seeds, tools, stories, and ways of doing things that will quietly thread into the fabric of later South Asian history. They didn't vanish. They changed address. Vanished makes it sound like a light going off, but human populations don't usually work that way. 5 million people don't all stand in one place, wait for the monsoon to fail, and then collectively step off a cliff. They do something much quieter, and in the long run, much more powerful. They adapt. If you zoom out from the crumbling drains and shrinking rooms of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, the map rearranges itself. Densely packed clusters of sites along the Khagga Hakra dry up. The big urban dots in Sindh fade, but new smaller dots appear somewhere else, thickening in eastern Punjab, in Haryana, in western Uttar Pradesh where the Ganga and Yamuna braid and unbraid, thickening in Gujarat and Saurashtra, along coasts and peninsulas and low hills where rainfall, though fickle, still has a little more generosity. The pattern is simple. People follow the water. For generations the Indus world had been tuned to a particular rhythm. Strong summer monsoon, regular river flow, cool winters that suited wheat and barley in the northwest. When the monsoon starts misbehaving, weakening overall, becoming more erratic, delivering less to some regions and more to others, that tuning slips out of key. But instead of simply starving in place, farmers begin to play a different song. In the drier core zones, along the Indus and its western tributaries, and on the old Khagga Hakra belt, the balance of crops changes. Archaeobotanists sifting through charred grains in late levels find fewer of the classic winter staples, wheat and barley, and more of the tough little seeds that thrive when rain is stingy. Small millets, sorghum, these are not glamorous crops. They don't have the same later cultural prestige as wheat or rice, but they are resilient. They tolerate poor soils, they shrug at short droughts, they ripen fast. In a world where the monsoon might falter for years at a time, these plants are survival partners. Picture a family standing in a field that their grandparents sowed with barley. Now the stream that used to run clear beside it is a chain of stagnant pools. The winter rains are unreliable. Somebody, at some point, has the thought, what if we shift? What if we plant this other grain some travelling cousin mentioned? The one that doesn't mind if the clouds change their mind halfway through the season. They try it. It works enough. The next year, they plant a bit more. Slowly, the texture of the landscape changes from high. Uniform barley stands to a patchwork of millets, sorghum, pulses, and whatever else can handle the new normal. Further east, the story bends differently. There, as you move toward the upper Ganga Yamuna Doab, the weakening of the monsoon that hurt Sindh and the Gagahakra corridor is less catastrophic. The rains are still irregular, but the overall pattern favours a different kind of adaptation. Rice. In the late Harappan and post-urban layers of some eastern sites, rice grains and husks become increasingly common. It's not yet the full, irrigated paddy system of much later South Asia, but it's a hint of the agricultural future. A wetter east responding to a moody sky by leaning into a crop that can drink deeply when the water does come. Taken together, the archaeobotanical evidence doesn't show a single, uniform strategy. It shows something more impressive. Local flexibility. One valley experiments with millets, another pushes rice. Somewhere else people cling to wheat and barley a bit longer, mixing in new species as backup. The farmers who had once fed cities are now feeding scattered villages, but they haven't forgotten how to think with plants. The settlements that anchor those fields are no longer the grand brick grids of the mature Harappan age. They are smaller, simpler, more various. Along the lower Indus in Sindh, the urban pattern breaks down into what archaeologists call the Juka phase. Here, you still find pots that look like descendants of Harappan forms, similar clays, echoes of earlier shapes. You still find beads, some copper, signs of craft skills inherited from city forebears. But you don't find carefully aligned streets or standardized bricks or formal drains marching along every lane. Jukar sites are modest. Some are semi-nomadic campgrounds. The people who live in them herd animals, cultivate small plots, and move when they have to. The big shared structures of the urban age, the weights and measures, the distant trade bureaucracy, the tiled seal offices, dissolve into more local personal systems. Later, in the same general region, an even more mobile pattern appears, often called the Janga phase. Herders and villagers range over a drying landscape, leaving behind patchy traces of pottery and hearths. It's not that they are less civilized. They are just living in a world where a vast, centralized urban machine no longer fits the climate. South and east in Gujarat, the story rhymes but doesn't repeat. At Rangpur, for example, you can read it layer by layer. Deep down, there are levels that look very much like any other mature Harappan town. Familiar brickwork, familiar ceramics, familiar sense of connection to the Indus heartland. Above that, as time passes and the big cities falter, you see something different. The pottery styles start to shift. Classic forms are still there, but new shapes and decorations join them. The architecture remains mostly in mud brick, but the layouts simplify. The crop mix changes. Millets and rice appear alongside older staples. Archaeologists label these levels as Rangpur or Prabhas cultures, regional late Harappan horizons. What you're seeing is a blending. Old Harappan traditions, ways of firing clay, of laying bricks, of organizing household space, persist. But they fuse with local preferences, with new motifs, with new agricultural schedules tuned to the specific rhythms of Gujarat's coast and interior. Farther north, in Punjab, the cemetery H culture we brushed against at Harappa carries that same theme of continuity and change into the realm of belief and identity. The shift toward cremation and urn burials doesn't scream invasion. The pottery with its bold black paintings doesn't look like it was dropped from the sky by a totally foreign people. It looks like a community working out new ways of marking life and death in a world where the old urban order has unravelled. Some individuals in those cemeteries may be descended from migrants, others from long-term locals. The important thing is that the cultural language they're speaking is recognisably Harappan-derived, but with a new accent. For a long time, people argued bitterly over who, exactly, these late and post-urban populations were. Were they the original Harappans clinging on in reduced circumstances? Were they newcomers who had swept in and pushed the city builders aside? Were they mixtures? Ancient DNA is beginning quietly to tip the scales. From a burial at Rakhigarhi, one of the largest Harappan cities in what is now Haryana, researchers have managed to extract and sequence the genome of an individual who lived there during the urban peak. When they compare that genetic profile to modern South Asian populations, a pattern emerges. A big part, perhaps 2/3 or more, of the ancestry of many present-day groups in the subcontinent looks closely related to this Indus periphery component. The Harappan-like signal doesn't vanish at 1900 BCE. It threads forward, braided later with other incoming ancestries, but still dominant in many regions. The sample size is still tiny. We don't yet have genomes from Juka herders or Rangpur villagers or cemetery H-urns. The details will almost certainly get more complicated as more data arrives. But the broad suggestion is hard to ignore. The people of the Indus did not, in any simple demographic sense, get replaced. They became ancestors. Urban institutions faded, genes did not. Pottery styles mutated, lineages continued. A child born in a little millet-field village in the upper Ganga Yamuna Doab, centuries after Mohenjo-daro's drains clogged for the last time, might still be carrying a very similar genetic toolkit to a child once born beside the Great Bath. What changed most profoundly wasn't the people themselves, but the way they organised their lives. Cities require a certain kind of social architecture. You need systems that can coordinate thousands of unrelated households, standards for bricks and weights, rules for cleaning drains, shared rituals and authorities that everybody more or less accepts. You need surplus production and storage and redistribution. When the climate makes that level of coordination too costly, when keeping the big machine running yields less and less benefit compared to its maintenance, people start opting out. The late Harappan and successor cultures show what they opted into instead. Smaller kin-based communities where trust runs along family lines more than through abstract institutions, local leaders rather than far-off administrators. Trade, yes, but mostly with neighbours and nearby regions instead of distant coasts and mountains. Decision-making scaled to the village or the cluster of hamlets instead of the whole river basin. You can think of it as a kind of social downshifting. The urban Indus world had been an experiment in large-scale integration. When the monsoon faltered and the rivers shifted, that experiment was wound back to a level where it could breathe. And yet, even in that scaled-down form, the knowledge accumulated over centuries of city life didn't vanish. Techniques for making durable bricks, for digging and lining wells, for storing grain against lean years, for weaving cotton into cloth, for shaping beads and casting copper, for negotiating marriages and exchanges between villages. These are not things that disappear in a single bad generation. They filter into stories, into habits, into the way we've always done it, even when nobody remembers the great platforms and reservoirs that once made those skills glamorous. So when we say that 5 million people vanished, what we really mean is that a particular way of being together, densely packed, highly standardized, spectacularly coordinated, came to an end. The people themselves walked out along riverbanks and dusty roads and coastal paths, in ones and twos and family groups, into different kinds of futures. They swapped wheat for millet, or barley for rice. They traded a city street for a village lane, a baked brick courtyard for a mud brick yard shaded by a single tree. They buried their dead in new ways. They spoke languages we can no longer hear, but whose descendants still curl on tongues from Karachi to Kolkata. They did not disappear. They adapted, fragmented, recombined, and, over long, slow centuries, they became the background population of a subcontinent whose later stories, Vedic chants, epic new cities on new rivers would all unfold on top of their buried bricks. The cities went quiet, the people kept talking. When a great civilization fades, our first instinct is often to look for a villain. We imagine armies at the gates, plague ships in the harbour, the ground splitting open and swallowing whole neighbourhoods. A single bad night that explains everything. The Indus world has attracted all of these stories. For much of the 20th century, one of them dominated. The idea that the cities were destroyed by invading Aryans. If you open an old history book, you might still find the scene. British archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler standing over scattered skeletons at Mohenjo-daro, imagining the final hours of the city. Bodies lying in the streets, unburied. Broken bones. He ties this to later Vedic hymns about a storm god, Indra, who shatters cities. In Wheeler's reconstruction, the pieces fit together almost too neatly. Indus cities, silent, unburied dead, massacre. New Indo-Aryan speakers, conquerors, problem solved. Except, slowly, the puzzle came apart. Later, archaeologists went back to those bones and those layers with quieter eyes. They mapped exactly where each skeleton came from. They looked at the surrounding pottery and debris. They checked the stratigraphy, the way the soil builds up over time, and the massacre evaporated. The skeletons that had looked like a single moment of slaughter turned out to belong to different episodes, different centuries. Some lay in contexts that seemed to be long after the city's main occupation, when people were reusing the ruins. Many showed no signs of battle trauma at all. There was no thick ash layer, no charred destruction horizon, no spread of new weapons or new kinds of fortifications that would scream foreign conquest. At other major Indus sites, Harappa, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi, there is the same absence. No burned palaces, no mass graves full of arrowheads, no intrusive warrior graves full of unfamiliar gear. Wheeler himself, later in life, stepped back from his most dramatic claims. The old Aryan invasion story hasn't completely left modern politics and imagination. But in archaeology, it's largely been retired. Instead of a sudden violent replacement, the picture that's emerging is more entangled. Gradual migrations, language shifts, mixtures of populations over many centuries, layered on top of an already transforming landscape. So if not invaders, then maybe the earth itself. In the lower Indus, at Mohenjo-daro in particular, another story rises out of the ground. Everywhere you dig, you hit water. Excavators have long noticed strange patterns there. thick bands of silt and clay that look like flood deposits. Whole streets rebuilt on top of earlier ones. Massive brick platforms and raised embankments that seem to have been designed to lift houses and public buildings away from rising water. It's as if the city was climbing onto tiptoe. Geologists like G.F. Rakes proposed a mechanism for this. The Indus River doesn't just flow, it rides over a restless crust. If a section of land between the lower river and the sea were pushed up by tectonic forces, even by a few meters it could act like a natural dam. The river blocked would spread sideways, backing up into a long shallow reservoir. The water level would creep higher year by year, seeping into streets, undermining foundations, demanding new terraces, new flood walls. Mohenjo-daro might have endured cycle after cycle of this, each flood forcing the inhabitants to rebuild a little higher, until, one day, walking away was easier than lifting another brick. It's a ghostly plausible vision. But even if a tectonic dam did once back the Indus up for 100 miles, even if Mohenjo-daro was slowly drowned, it would still only be part of the story. Flood deposits and raised platforms make sense there, in that low, flat basin. They do not explain why inland cities like Dholavira, perched on a rocky island in Gujarat, or settlements far up the Ghaggar Hakra and in the eastern Punjab, also shrink and simplify over roughly the same broad arc of centuries. Earthquakes may have rattled walls, floods may have soaked bricks, yet neither leaves the kind of synchronized scar across the whole Indus domain that you would expect if they were the single trigger. Another suspect lurks in the drains. Urban density has always been a bargain with disease. Thousands of people packed into tight quarters, sharing water, sharing waste, sharing air. The Indus cities tried to manage that bargain with remarkable care. Covered drains along the streets, soak pits, bathing platforms, wells. But those systems were only as good as their maintenance and their water. When droughts lengthened and rivers shrank, the same sophisticated infrastructure that had once kept cities clean could start to fail. Stagnant pools, reduced flushing, wells running low or becoming contaminated. We don't have written epidemic chronicles from Harappa the way we do from later Mesopotamian or Greek cities. We don't have vials of ancient pathogens pulled from teeth. What we do have are quieter clues. In late levels at Harappa, skeletal evidence shows an uptick in chronic infections, diseases like leprosy and tuberculosis making themselves at home in stressed bodies. In a world tied together by long-distance trade, boats to Mesopotamia, caravans to the Iranian plateau and Oman, microbes would have travelled too, hitching rides in lungs and intestines, looking for any population whose immune defences were already worn thin by hunger and anxiety. It's easy to imagine waves of waterborne illness, dysentery, cholera-like diarrheal diseases, washing through neighbourhoods when the drains clogged and the wells went foul. But here, again, we have to be honest about the limits of the evidence. Disease almost certainly walked beside drought and disruption. It probably tipped some families, some quarters of some cities, from coping into collapse. Yet so far, it remains a cofactor, not a smoking gun. No single plague layer has been identified that lines up neatly with the broad, multi-century unwinding of urban life across the region. That brings us to a quieter, less dramatic, but maybe more powerful idea: internal fragility. Think back to what made the Indus world special at its peak. Standardized brick sizes across hundreds of miles, standardized weights for traders from Baluchistan to Gujarat, shared styles of seals, shared ways of laying out streets, shared drainage logic. All of that integration was a strength. It let them move goods and ideas efficiently. It created trust in distant dealings. A weight from one town meant the same as a weight from another. But it also meant that the system was tightly coupled. Farmers in one river basin grew more than they needed, using the familiar patterns of the monsoon. Surplus flowed into cities, where specialists turned it into beads and textiles and copper tools. Merchants carried those out to sea and along mountain passes, bringing back timber and stone and metals. Change one part of that chain, and the others begin to shudder. Climate research now suggests that the monsoon shifts weren't just a single bad season, or even a single bad generation. They came as repeated, decades-long droughts, punctuated by partial recoveries, stretching over centuries. Rainfall dropped by perhaps 10 or 20% in many core regions. Temperatures nudged up. Rivers weakened, lakes shrank. In a sprawling, flexible mosaic of small villages, such changes are painful but survivable. People plant different crops, drill new wells, move a few kilometers up or down a valley. In a system that depends on large, hungry urban centers, they are more dangerous. If harvests thin, surplus shrinks. If surplus shrinks, it becomes harder to support full-time specialists, scribes, seal makers, administrators, long-distance traders. If long-distance trade falters, so do the flows of prestige goods and raw materials that help hold elite networks together. If elites lose their grip, the shared standards and bureaucracies that once coordinated brick sizes and drain widths start to fray. What you see in the archaeology of the late Harappan phase looks very much like this kind of cascading unravelling. Weights and seals become rarer, writing appears less frequently, then not at all. Bricks drift away from the old 1:2:4 ratio. Drains are repaired more crudely or not at all. Neighbourhoods contract. Some quarters of cities are abandoned while others limp on. None of this requires a new enemy at the gate. It only requires that the stresses keep accumulating faster than the institutions can adapt. By the time an earthquake shakes a vulnerable town, or a flood eats away at a weakened embankment, or an epidemic finds a city already struggling to keep its wells clean, the margins of safety are thin. A shock that might once have been absorbed becomes the final nudge that sends people packing. This, more and more, is how scholars talk about the end of the Indus urban age. Not as a single catastrophe, but as a long, regionally varied series of pressures, monsoon weakening and river instability at the core, with the local earthquakes, floods, disease outbreaks, and institutional brittleness acting as amplifiers. Each city has its own story within that wider pattern. Mohenjo-daro fighting rising water until it gives up. Doliver re-engineering its reservoirs, then slowly letting its monumental spaces go quiet. Harappa fragmenting into smaller occupations, its cemetery styles changing as its role in regional network shifts. And over all of this hangs a silence we cannot break. We can model rainfall. We can read sediments and bones. We can trace where rivers used to flow. But we cannot yet read the signs the Harappans carved into their seals. We don't know what they call their cities, their gods, their offices. We don't know how they explained the failing monsoon to themselves, what debates raged in their councils, what gambles they took that didn't pay off. For now, the best we can say is this. There was no single night when 5 million people vanished. There was a long series of hard years in which the climate they depended on shifted, and the complex machine they had built to thrive under that climate proved less flexible than the people inside it. The invaders, the earthquakes, the plagues, they may have visited. But the real drama was slower, more diffuse, spread out in time and space, woven into choices made in fields and workshops and kitchens. And somewhere in that long unwinding, the Indus cities released their hold and the people walked away into new patterns of life. The mystery doesn't end there. Because even as the bricks crumbled, the memory of that world, its skills, its habits, its ways of managing water and space, left traces that later generations would rediscover without quite knowing whose footsteps they were following. For almost 3,000 years after those last bricks were laid, the Indus world slept under its own dust. Villages rose and fell on top of old walls. Farmers ploughed through buried streets without knowing it. Rivers shifted and washed away corners of ancient suburbs. Somewhere beneath railway embankments and mustard fields, the outlines of entire cities waited in the dark. Our rediscovery of them begins not with a dramatic moment of revelation, but with a man on horseback, riding through the Punjab in the 1830s and 40s. His name was Charles Masson. He wasn't thinking about lost civilizations. He was a deserter from the British Army, turned wanderer and antiquarian, drifting through Baluchistan, Afghanistan, and the Punjab with a notebook and a restless mind. In 1842 he published his travels. Tucked into the pages is a description of a curious place near a village called Harappa. He writes of great mounds, of bricks that locals are carting away to build roads and barracks, of occasional carved stones. To him, this is some ancient, perhaps medieval or early historic settlement, interesting but not world-shattering. He has no way of knowing that he is one of the first modern eyes to rest on the ruins of a Bronze Age metropolis. The next footsteps belong to Alexander Cunningham. In the 1850s, and again in the 1870s, he visits Harappa. By then, he has become the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, the man charged with mapping the subcontinent's antiquities. He digs a little, sketches a little, and uncovers a small square seal carved with a short line of strange symbols and the image of a unicorn-like animal. He publishes it in 1875, assuming it must be some variant of a script like Brahmi. Nobody yet realizes what that tiny object really is, a message from an entire civilization whose name has been forgotten. For almost 50 more years the ruins keep their deeper secret. Then, in the 1920s, the ground finally begins to speak. Under the direction of Sir John Marshall at the Archaeological Survey of India, systematic excavations start at Harappa and at another mound further south, near a village called Mohenjo-daro. Indian archaeologists like Dayaram Sahni and R.D. Banerjee open long, careful trenches. What they uncover does not look like a random ruined fort or a single palace or a temple complex. It looks like a city, street after street of baked brick, drains running straight and true beneath them, rows of houses with bathrooms and courtyards, granaries, public wells, standardized weights, dozens, then hundreds of those strange little seals. Layer by layer the realization sinks in. This is not just another old site. This is something else entirely. An urban tradition at least as old as early dynastic Mesopotamia, as complex as anything in Egypt. A whole civilization had been living quietly under the word Harappa, without anyone suspecting it. In 1924, Marshall announces it to the world as the Indus Civilization. It is as if someone has turned on a light in a room we didn't know existed. Since then, that light has slowly grown brighter, spreading out from a few famous names, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, to a constellation of hundreds of sites across today's Pakistan and northwest India. Each new excavation adds another shard to the picture. One of the clearest windows into this lost world stands far to the southwest, on a rocky island in the salty Rann of Kutch, Dholavira. If you walk its ruins today, you can still feel the bones of the city under your feet. A fortified citadel, a middle town, a lower town, great water reservoirs cut into the bedrock, an immense cemetery fanning out beyond the walls. Archaeologists have traced its life from around 3000 BCE to about 1500 BCE, spanning early, mature, and late Harappan phases. They can see the moment when it booms, the moment when it restructures, the moment when the monumental heart quiets. In 2021, UNESCO inscribed Dholavira, a Harappan city, on the World Heritage List. On paper, that sounds like a bureaucratic act, another line on a register. In reality, it marks something more intimate. It is the world's acknowledgement that this dry, silent place, once surrounded by monsoon-fed streams and careful reservoirs, belongs not only to the region, but to the shared story of human urban life. India has begun to treat it that way. Conservation laboratories, interpretation centres, pathways that help visitors trace ancient streets in their minds, work that slows the decay, that keeps salt and wind from erasing the subtle traces of drains and doorways. While Dholavira tells us how a Harappan city, in a marginal water-scarce landscape adapted over 15 centuries, another site, farther east, in the gentle fields of Haryana, has become the new frontier, Rakhigarhi. At first glance, it is just a cluster of low mounds scattered among present-day houses, buffalo sheds, and ponds. But surveys and repeated excavations since the late 1990s have revealed something staggering. This quiet village is sitting on top of what may be the largest Harappan city ever discovered, spreading over several square kilometres. Here too, archaeologists trace a long story. From a modest early settlement to a mature urban centre with baked brick architecture, specialised craft areas, and an extensive cemetery. Kilns and beads and shell-working floors whisper of lives spent turning raw materials into the objects that once moved through Indus trade networks. Rakhigarhi has also given the Indus dead a new kind of voice, genetic. From one particularly well-preserved burial, scientists extracted ancient DNA. In 2019, they published the results. The genome of that woman shows links to populations in and around the Indus sphere, but no detectable ancestry from later steppe pastoralist groups in that individual. It is a single data point, but in a landscape of fragmentary evidence, even one point attracts intense attention. For some, it hints at lines of continuity between Harappan populations and later South Asian groups. For others, it feeds into wider debates about when and how Indo-European languages spread. Archaeologists and geneticists, cautious by training, emphasize that the picture is still incomplete. Yet outside the journals, in public discourse and politics, interpretations race ahead of the data. Meanwhile, the Earth keeps offering more. In 2026, a new 3-year excavation program began at Rakhigarhi, aimed at mapping the outer mounds more precisely, probing potential defensive works, and tracing how far the city really spread. Even its size is still a live question. The outline of this ancient metropolis is being redrawn in real time. Further west, in Kutch, the story shimmers in and out of focus along a harsher frontier. There, archaeologists are piecing together what it meant to live at the edge of the Indus world, in a landscape always flirting with drought. Near Lakhpat, a 5,300-year-old early Harappan settlement has come to light, roughly contemporary with Dholavira's own early growth. Nearby, a large cemetery at Junakatiya, with more than 100 graves, and new sites like Padta are revealing local ways of burying the dead, local choices in pottery and ornaments, local strategies for handling uncertainty. These are not the great textbook cities. They are smaller, more vulnerable, more improvisational. Together, they show that the Indus civilization was never a single uniform block. It was a patchwork of micro-stories, coastal traders, inland farmers, desert-edge settlers, each adapting the broad Harappan toolkit to their own corner of the map. And yet, over and over, our understanding runs up against the same barrier. Those little seals that Cunningham puzzled over, the signs carved above gateways at Dholavira, brief inscriptions on pots and tablets from Rakhigarhi and 100 other places, the Indus script. We have found thousands of examples now, perhaps 5,000 inscriptions on seals, ceilings, pottery, tools. We can count the distinct signs, somewhere between 400 and 600 depending on how finely you classify them. We can see patterns in the way those signs line up, a preferred direction of writing, regularities that look very much like abbreviations of real language, but we cannot read them. Decades of attempts have proposed every imaginable solution. Dravidian, early Indo-Aryan, a lost language family. None has convinced a majority of specialists. More recently, computer scientists have begun to feed the corpus into machine learning models, looking for hidden structures in sign order and co-occurrence. These methods confirm that the system behaves like writing, not random symbols, but so far they have not cracked its code. If we could read those tiny texts, they might tell us what the Harappans called their rivers, how they measured time, what kinds of offices and clans and gods they recognized. They might preserve contracts, rituals, land grants, prayers. They might give us, in their own words, a glimpse of how they understood the long drying of the monsoon. For now, we stand outside that door, listening, and even as we listen, the ruins themselves are under pressure. Mohenjo-daro, that great city by the lower Indus, sits in a floodplain where the water table is rising. Salts creep up through ancient bricks, flour on walls in pale crusts, then eat them away from the inside. Preservation teams race to stabilize what they can, but water is patient, and politics and resources are finite. Harappa too, and many other sites, lie in regions shaped by modern borders and tensions. Some mounds are sliced by railway lines or highways. Others are overlain by living towns and fields. Archaeologists often work in narrow windows, rescue digs ahead of construction, small trenches negotiated with local landowners, trying to read a whole book through a few scattered sentences. On top of that, interpretations of what is found do not live in a vacuum. Debates over the lost Saraswati River, over where and when different language families arrived, over how ancient DNA should be read, are sometimes swept up into present-day struggles over identity and heritage. Scholars write in careful conditional language. Public narratives, political speeches, and school textbooks are often less cautious. So the rediscovery of the Indus world is not a simple, triumphant unveiling of a forgotten past. It is a slow, contested, fragile process, pulling fragments of a drowned city system back into the light, while the earth, water, and our own present concerns tug them in other directions. And yet, piece by piece, the outline grows clearer. We now know that those mounds Masson rode past were not isolated oddities, but the tips of a vast, interconnected urban network. We know that the people who built them mastered water in ways that still impress engineers. We know that when their cities thinned out, their descendants did not vanish but carried skills and habits into new landscapes. The lost world is not entirely lost anymore. In the next breaths, we can follow its faint echoes forward into the rituals, crafts, and everyday rhythms of South Asian life that may still be carrying, in altered forms, the fingerprints of Harappa. If you walk through a village in Sindh or Punjab at dusk, when the heat is finally bleeding out of the bricks and the cooking fires are just starting, you can still bump into the ghost of Harappa. They're not wearing bronze jewellery or wrapped in ancient cotton. They're creaking past you on 2 wooden wheels. In many fields today, farmers still hitch a pair of bullocks to a solid-wheeled cart with a simple yoke and a flat wooden bed. The silhouette is unmistakable. So unmistakable that when archaeologists first cleaned the dust off terracotta cart models from Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, tiny clay toys with stubby bulls and little wheels that once actually turned, they noticed something almost disorienting. The basic design hasn't changed in 4,000 years. Same 2-wheeled box, same straight axle, same broad, solid discs for wheels rather than spoked circles. The materials are different now. Iron bolts here, a bit of rubber there. But the logic is the same. You need to move grain, bricks, people, fodder. You have cattle. You build the simplest, toughest vehicle that will survive rutted tracks and monsoon mud. Nobody in that modern village is thinking, I am using Harappan technology. But the solution they reach for has been tested and retested since the days when seals with unicorns were pressed into wet clay. The houses too are familiar. A typical Harappan home, as we've seen in Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dolavera, Rakhigahi, doesn't flaunt itself to the street. Outside you get a plain wall, maybe a doorway, maybe a small opening. Step inside and the house opens inward around a light-filled courtyard. Rooms cluster along the sides, storage spaces, sleeping rooms, a stair to the roof, a bathing area with a sloping floor and a drain. Cross to an old town in Lahore, Ahmedabad, Multan, Jaisalmer. Push through a narrow doorway. You find yourself again in a cool, shaded courtyard, open to the sky, with rooms folded around it like careful paper. The materials have shifted. Timber balconies now, carved stone pillars. But the idea is the same. Protect privacy, catch light from above, create a ventilated core where children can play and elders can sit and talk while the day burns overhead. Architectural historians are careful. They warn that similar climates and social needs can produce similar house plans, even without a direct line of descent. Heat, dust, monsoon rain, extended families living together. These push you toward inward-looking houses almost automatically. Still, it is hard not to feel a quiet thread running through time. The same sun, the same monsoon, the same problem of making a livable space out of baked earth and stone. Solutions ripple forward for millennia. Some legacies are written in water. In Dolavera, the city we visited on that rocky island in the Rann of Kutch, engineers 4,500 years ago carved rectangular reservoirs into the bedrock, lined them with stone masonry, and built flights of steps that descended all the way to the floor. Seasonal streams were diverted by check dams into channels that fed these tanks. When the monsoon came, the city caught and held as much of it as possible, turning a marginal, semi-arid landscape into a survivable home. In Rakhigahi, recent excavations have uncovered a vast reservoir second only to Dolavera in scale, again with long sides, lined faces and stepped access. The pattern is not an isolated quirk, it is a habit of mind. Treat water as precious, store it in big accessible containers you can walk down into as the level drops, wrap public life around its edges. Fast forward 2,000-3,000 years. In Gujarat and Rajasthan, between about the 7th and 16th centuries CE, a new architectural form blossoms, the stepwell. Locally, vav or baoli. Deep shafts, sometimes 8 or 9 stories down, lined with stone, fronted by long corridors of steps that descend with you as you follow the retreating water table. Some are plain, others riotously carved with columns, shrines and pillared pavilions. They are wells, reservoirs, temples and community centres all at once. Art historians looking at Dolavera and at these medieval stepwells see strong family resemblances. The scale is different, the religious imagery later, but the core idea is hauntingly similar. In a land where the monsoon can fail, you build stone-lined step structures to trap every drop. Can we draw a straight line from Harappan reservoirs to the stepwells of Patan and Adalaj? Most scholars will shake their heads gently. Too much time, too many missing links, too many chances for reinvention. And yet, the same problem, unreliable rain over thirsty ground, confronts generation after generation. The same river basins, the same seasonal streams. Communities grow up among buried Harappan ruins, quarry ancient bricks, inherit old knowledge of where water sits in the rock. Techniques for digging, lining and maintaining large tanks move between cultures, often without anyone bothering to write them down. When a medieval ruler orders a stepwell built, the masons drawing their designs may be pulling on a chain of practice that stretches far beyond any inscription. Ancestry does not have to be conscious to be real. The same is true of the fields. As the Indus cities shrank and the monsoon turned fickle, farmers didn't just give up. Archaeobotanical studies, charred grains, seeds, impressions left in ancient mud bricks, show them gradually changing their strategy. The earlier urban heyday leans heavily on wheat and barley, crops that drink deep and reward consistent water. In the later phases, as drought episodes lengthen, we see more millets appear, little grains like bajra and jawar that can shrug off dry spells. Pulses too, lentils, chickpeas, mung beans, start to share space in the fields. In some eastern regions and river-fed zones, rice joins the mix. Instead of betting everything on a narrow crop portfolio, late Harappan farmers diversify. Wheat if the winter rains are kind, millet if they are not, pulses to fix nitrogen and hedge against cereal failure. Mixed fields stagger risk across different growth cycles and water needs. That pattern, cereals and pulses sown together or in rotation, millet sitting alongside rice and wheat, is still the backbone of South Asian agriculture. Walk across the Deccan in a bad monsoon year, and you will see hardy millets standing where thirsty rice has failed. Talk to farmers in Haryana or Gujarat about why they plant certain mixes, and you will hear the same reasoning. Don't put all your hope into one crop. Spread it, so that if one fails, the others might carry you through. It is logic carved by long memory of uncertainty, refined generation after generation. The Harappans were some of the first to work it out on a regional scale. Their descendants, scattered after the cities emptied, carried both seeds and habits with them into the Ganga plains, into Rajasthan, into the foothills. Not as a conscious Harappan package, but as simple, hard-won common sense about how to live with a moody monsoon. When we turn from fields and reservoirs to religion, the echoes become more controversial, and the air thicker with debate. One small steatite seal from Mohenjo-daro, about 3.5 centimetres wide, has become strangely famous. On it sits a figure with horns or a horned headdress, knees out, heels together, in a posture that looks a lot like a yogic squat or cross-legged seat. Around this central figure prowl animals, an elephant, a tiger, a rhinoceros, a buffalo. Early Indian scholars and later museum labels started calling this the Pashupati seal, linking it to Shiva as Lord of the Beasts, Pashupati, protector of animals and ascetics. It is tempting. The posture feels familiar from later iconography. The horns suggest divinity or wildness. The animals circling like a mandala hint at a god who sits above the jungle, but most modern Indus specialists counsel restraint. The script on the seal is unread. We don't know the myths, the chants, the stories that went with that carved image. The same goes for the clay female figurines found in many Harappan levels. Broad hips, elaborate headdresses, sometimes with infants perched on them, sometimes holding objects. Early excavators quickly labelled them mother goddesses, and connected them to later Hindu goddesses, Devi, Durga, Lakshmi, the many faces of Shakti. Again, it's a plausible line, and perhaps not entirely wrong. Fertility, protection, the power of women's bodies, these are near universal religious themes. In South Asia they become intensely important in later tradition. Yet when we look closely, the figurines are diverse. Some are carefully made, others rough. Some may be toys, some offerings, some teaching tools. A single overarching goddess cult might be too simple a story. At Kalibangan, on the dry Gaga plain, archaeologists uncovered brick-lined, carefully shaped fire pits in rows. Some have compared them to later Vedic or Hindu fire altars, the yajna hearths around which priests chant and pour ghee into the flames. If that link is right, then Harappans might have been participating in some early form of the fire rituals that later Sanskrit texts describe. But here too the evidence is thin. We can see that fire mattered. We can see care in the way those pits were built. We cannot hear the words spoken around them. So in this realm, the realm of gods and rites, we are walking on softer ground. There may be deep continuities between Harappan practices and later Hindu traditions. There may also be ruptures we cannot yet see, reinventions and new beginnings. Without the Indus texts, the best we can say is that some motifs, the powerful seated figure among animals, the female body as symbol, the sacred flame, appear early and stay important. They are like shapes under a cloth. We can trace the outline with our fingers, but not name them with certainty. Put all of this together, carts and courtyards, reservoirs and stepwells, mixed crops, ambiguous gods, and a different picture of collapse begins to emerge. The cities of the Indus did not simply fall and vanish like a dropped pot shattering into useless shards. They disassembled. Bricks walked away to build new walls. Farmers walked east with their seeds and their memories of drought. Craftspeople carried techniques for beads and wheels into new markets. Rituals shifted, hybridized, were forgotten and rediscovered under different names. Civilizations, it turns out, don't usually die like organisms. They molt. The old urban shell cracks under pressure. Climate stress, faltering rivers, changing trade, and inside the living culture wriggles free, smaller and not as shiny but very much alive, looking for a new form to grow into. When you watch a bullock cart roll down a dusty Punjab lane, or stand at the lip of a deep stepwell in Gujarat, or sit in the shade of a courtyard house during the hot months, you are, possibly, quietly, standing inside that new form. The people doing these things may never have heard the word Harappan. They don't need to. Their lives are the long echo of choices made when the monsoon stopped listening, and an old urban world learned, painfully, how to become something else. In that sense, the 5 million people who disappeared never really went anywhere. They're still here, braided into daily routines, into the crops sown before the rains, into the ways water is hoarded and shared, into the half-remembered stories told by firelight. Ghosts that never left, only changed clothes, and if their story has anything to teach us, it is this. When the climate shifts and the big systems strain, what survives are not the walls, or the inscriptions, or the impressive drains. What survives are habits, flexible farming, careful water, tools that last, social bonds strong enough to bend without breaking. Those are the things that slip across the fault lines of history and keep walking. In the last stretch of this journey, we can turn back to those habits and to the quiet lessons waiting in the dust of the Indus for anyone who might one day need to live through a changing world, which of course includes us. Tonight, more than 1.5 billion people sleep under the same monsoon sky the Harappans watched. From Karachi to Kolkata, from Kabul down to Kanyakumari, lives a still time to that pulse of summer rain. Fields wait, dams wait, city taps, and village wells wait. When the monsoon arrives on schedule, it feels like a promise kept. When it stumbles, everything tightens. Climate change is nudging that rhythm offbeat. Some years now, the clouds come in violent, concentrated bursts, drowning whole districts in a day. Other years there are long, hot pauses when the air shimmers, reservoirs shrink and farmers stare at empty skies, wondering if the season has already failed. Models don't all agree on the exact future, but together they sketch a pattern. More extremes, more uncertainty. Upstream, in the high, cold ranges that feed the Indus, the great glaciers are thinning. For a while, that melt can make the rivers look fuller, but many projections suggest that, in the long run, flows could drop sharply as the ice retreats, adding a new kind of fragility to a basin that already supports hundreds of millions of people. Dams, pollution, overpumping, rapid cities, all of it presses on the same water that once ran past Harappan wharves. In that light, the Indus story stops being just a distant curiosity and starts to feel like a rehearsal. When their monsoon weakened, Harappan communities didn't build ever higher walls and dare the sky to do its worst. They bent, they walked. They changed what grew in their fields, favouring millets that could live on less, mixing crops to spread risk. They followed surviving rivers and greener ground, moving east toward the Ganga plains, drifting into hills and coasts and smaller, more flexible settlements. They let their cities go so that their communities could endure. We don't have to copy their choices. Our world is different. Satellites, concrete, international treaties, megacities that can't simply fold up and migrate. But the underlying instinct, the willingness to adapt, to accept that water sets the terms, to protect people over monuments, is still available to us. You can think of the Harappans as having left two inheritances. One is buried, bricks, beads, drains, the undeciphered script. The other is quiet and living, an attitude toward uncertainty, a habit of working with a fickle monsoon instead of pretending to command it. So, as you drift towards sleep, picture this. A late evening in Mohenjo-daro not long before the end. The air is warm, the last light sliding off the baked brick. In a narrow lane, a family closes their courtyard door. They lift the latch, perhaps wrap a rope around it, secure it in some ordinary way they've done 1,000 times. They think they're leaving for a season or a few years. Maybe they're following kin to a village where the wells still hold, or to lands farther east where people say the rains are better. They have a bundle of seed, a small pouch of beads, a copper tool or two wrapped in cloth. They carry stories of a city that once gleamed beside a generous river. Behind them, the door settles into stillness. No one will open it again for 4,000 years, but the people don't vanish. They walk on into the dark, into new fields, into other languages and customs and names, their memories dissolving into those of the generations that follow. Somewhere, far ahead in time, a farmer harnesses 2 bullocks to a cart. A mason marks out the sides of a step well. A child plays in a courtyard as thunder rolls over a hot plain. The city sleeps under the dust. Its habits keep moving. If you've made it this far, thank you for keeping them company tonight, and for letting the story be part of your evening. If you'd like more slow journeys through the past, you can gently tap like and subscribe, so you'll find your way back here next time. If you feel awake enough, you can even leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. And if you'd like to support the channel a little more, there's an option to join as a member. It's completely optional, but very much appreciated. For now, let the rivers, the rains, and the quiet streets of Mohenjo-daro fade into the background hum of your thoughts. The Harappans have walked on ahead. You can follow them later. Tonight, you can rest. Good night.